This is the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. Categorizing violence is a messy business. What one writer might call the actions of a terrorist, another might refer to as the work of a freedom fighter. The very individuals who are called heroes, warriors, and revolutionaries by some can be categorized as villains, murderers, and radicals by another. But when the morality of a violent person is highly controversial or just ambiguous, we have a separate, more fuzzy term. We call them a vigilante. The earliest uses of vigilante seem to be taken from the Spanish word for watchman, vigilante. Various dictionaries state that a vigilante is somebody who seeks to act outside of the law to enact justice. Now, for religious people, the idea that what is right and wrong is bigger than just what is legal or illegal is extremely familiar. While much of the legal system may coincide with a religious person's worldview, it is virtually unthinkable that the two would be fully aligned outside of a theocracy. And most religious people are content to keep away from legal but spiritually impermissible wrongdoing by means of their own community and self-control. But for some, this hasn't been enough. The wrongdoing of fellow citizens and governors is so egregious to them that they have no choice but to act out, in sometimes violent ways. In order to understand what kind of person is willing to take the law into their own hands for the sake of their God, I explored religious vigilantism in recent history, very recent history, and ancient history. These stories cover Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in 3 separate acts with violence ranging from verbal harassment to mass suicide. Act 1. John Brown's Body. Christian abolitionist John Brown was hanged in Virginia just 2 years before the Civil War began in 1861. His crime? Treason, murder, and inciting rebellion. There's a famous painting of John Brown in the Kansas State House. In the painting, which was made by John Stuart Curry in 1942, John Brown stands between Confederate and Union soldiers. Brown is depicted as twice the height of the other men in the painting, with a long beard, wild hair, mouth agape, and wide eyes. With arms outstretched, Brown holds a rifle in one hand and a Bible in the other. Behind him, fires blaze and a tornado winds itself past the top of the mural. He looks crazy, a disturbed man with an overzealous sense of righteous anger which alone might permit the violent justice he seeks to bring down upon any slaveholder. But according to Manisha Sinha, abolitionist historian, professor at the University of Connecticut, and author of The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, this deranged portrayal of John Brown was likely a Southern concoction.
Brown was caricatured as this kind of insane, violent man. He was violent, but he was also seen as someone who was insane. I mean, somebody who was, a white man willing to give up his life for Black freedom. It had to be insanity, right? And especially Southerners who wrote lost cause mythologies of the Civil War were actually one of the first to write biographies of John Brown. First Southerners writing that he was insane and violent and a religious fanatic. That's how they saw Brown and abolitionists, to tell you frankly, as a whole. But there were many historians and others who wrote about, they were trying to understand why is John Brown taking upon himself to wage this war against slavery. And they used a religious explanation. They said, he was very inspired by especially the Old Testament and the fight of the Israelites and the fight of, the Hebrews against others, etc.
This posturing of John Brown may have been intended as a way to belittle or even condemn his life and work, but it seems to have contributed to the opposite. Today, John Brown is an American folk hero, remembered for an unflinching commitment to the freedom of all people. In the Civil War, the Union even marched to a song about him, called John Brown's Body.
John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. His soul is not before. Glory, glory,
This song would later be rewritten as the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
glory,
But before he was a mural in Kansas or a classic American folk song, John Brown was just a kid from Connecticut. And a look into his childhood shows that Brown wasn't just an independent rebel. In reality, abolitionism was his birthright.
So John Brown is usually seen as the sort of lone wolf abolitionist who took matters into his own hands and started this raid at Harper's Ferry. But actually, Brown was very much part of a broader abolition movement and its increasing turn towards direct action in the 1850s. He was born in Torrington, Connecticut, and very inspired by his grandfather, who had fought in the Revolutionary War and took the ideals of the revolution very seriously and did not see a color bar. And there are all these sort of apocryphal stories about John Brown, about how he got converted to abolition. As a child, he saw a young slave boy being hit with a shovel, or he saw something that suddenly made him turn towards abolition. But actually, his father was an abolitionist, Owen Brown. He had founded, or was one of the founding members of the Western Reserve Anti-Slavery Society in Ohio, where Brown grew up. And he remembered as a child reading The Liberator, which was the iconic abolitionist newspaper published by William Lloyd Garrison in Boston. So he was really growing up in an abolitionist milieu. In the 1840s, he is already meeting with Black abolitionists. He is writing for Black abolitionist newspapers. He meets with Frederick Douglass, the famous fugitive slave abolitionist in the late 1840s, in his home in Springfield. And Douglass is struck by the fact that here's a white abolitionist who feels the wrongs of slavery, as if he said, the iron of slavery had pierced his own soul, that he felt the wrongs of Black people in this country so deeply. So you can see that, when John Brown emerges in the 1850s, within the abolition movement, it's not just out of nowhere. He is very much part of the growth of the abolitionist movement in the 1830s and 40s. And by the early 1850s, he's already organizing what he called the League of Gileadites in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's an armed Black militia to resist the fugitive slave law. So here's where you can see John Brown already taking action against slavery in whatever way he could. By the mid-1850s, he goes to Kansas with his sons and takes part in the wars over Kansas. They're called the Kansas Wars, kind of a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. He rises to fame there because he's one of the few free state men willing to fight against pro-slavery invaders from Missouri, from the South, who are constantly trying to steal elections in Kansas. And he fights back. Most of the free staters don't, and he actually fights back. And he is encouraged, in fact, by other abolitionists to do this. They send him money, they send him, arms. He's already involved in freeing enslaved people in Kansas. One of them, he takes, a family, he takes them all the way to Canada. And on the way, one of the enslaved women has a baby, and she names him John Brown. So Harper's Ferry comes at the tail end of all of this. This is who John Brown was, a man who was really committed to waging war against slavery and who had been involved in nearly all the major actions that had been taken by the abolition movement until Harper's Ferry, where he plans to start a slave rebellion, but it is really a plan to run off slaves to the north, which abolitionists had started doing already much earlier. So again, he's not this lone wolf as he's often portrayed to be. He emerges from a family history of commitment to revolutionary ideals and abolitionist ideals. And he himself is very well acquainted with contemporary Black and white abolitionists.
Brown and his family's vigor for equality was deeply intertwined with their Christian faith.
I really researched John Brown in great depth, and I think he was a deeply Christian man. But I think that whole thing about him being some sort of old-fashioned, Old Testament Hebrew prophet, I don't see much of that in my own reading of his work. That he saw himself as somehow the divine instrument of God to smite down slaveholders. If you read what Brown himself is saying, you could really he sees himself as many New England Puritans, and he was a New England Puritan. That's where his family heritage is. It's a New England Puritan family, and a lot of these people become abolitionists. How he sees himself is that long list of Christian martyrs and Protestant martyrs, right? Who want to fight for the truth and in doing so are willing to lose their lives for it.
In the overwhelming majority of modern churches, a biblically backed understanding of anti-slavery is not at all controversial. For many who read the Bible today, the idea that God created all people in his image is sufficient evidence to invalidate a slaver's worldview. But at the time, many Christians looked to Scripture as justification for chattel slavery, citing certain passages in Scripture where God explained how Israelite slave masters ought to treat their slaves. Manisha made clear that slavery was a deeply controversial issue for American Christians in the mid-1800s.
I have looked at both sides of this question because my first book was on pro-slavery ideology and the use of the Constitution and the Bible by Southern slaveholders, particularly the more extreme pro-slavery ministers and politicians, to defend slavery. On the other hand, I have also studied the abolition movement in my second book, The Slave's Cause, in which I looked at how abolition emerges actually from also Christianity. So the early objections to permanent enslavement come particularly from dissenting Protestant sects, including some outstanding Catholic clerics. You also have Protestant dissenting sects right from the 17th century, objecting to the rise of slavery in the British North American colonies. And the most outstanding of them, of course, were the Quakers. It begins with a few dissenting Quaker, figures, but soon it becomes an article of faith for the Society of Friends. By the end of the 18th century, if you were a slave trader or slaveholder, you could not be a Quaker. And they're instrumental in the rise of the first wave of abolition that leads to emancipation in the northern states. And what they do is they really adhere to the principle of the gospel, right? Do unto others. Quakers also see slavery as a very violent form of subjugation. They're pacifists. They don't believe in violence. And they really object to the amount of violence that is being visited on Native Americans to dispossess them and African Americans to enslave them. So it goes part with their peace creed, with their peace principles to object to slavery. And then, of course, there are slave rebels who are fighting violently at times and voting their feet, running away, right? So Christianity is something that is really central, actually, also to the rise of abolition. But it is a certain kind of Christianity. Once African Americans form their own churches, they really take to heart the story from the Old Testament about the Israelites and how God frees them from Egyptian pharaohs, from slavery. They see themselves as the chosen people. They identify with the Israelites. And you can see this in Black Christianity a lot. And they are, of course, developing their own churches with their own messages about Christianity. Now, of course, in the South, though you had the early Methodists and some Baptists, evangelical religions that spread in the First Great Awakening before the American Revolution, you had some of them who were anti-slavery. I mean, the founders of Methodism, particularly, were anti-slavery. John Wesley basically was very influenced by Anthony Benezet, the American abolitionist and Quaker abolitionist. He actually just lifted all his words and put it in his pamphlet called Thoughts on Slavery. So that, if you notice, a lot of early African Americans turned towards Methodism because of that. But in the South, they quickly tame these religions. First, slaveholders object to Christianizing their slaves. They think, well, if they're Christians, that means they might be freed, right? Because they become brothers in Christ. And so they were really against the Christianization of their enslaved people. But once Christianity is domesticated towards slavery, where many ministers are telling slaveholders, don't worry, we will make them into better slaves. This is not going to be a threat to slavery. And increasingly in the South, especially around the 1820s or 30s, you have the growth of Southern churches around pro-slavery Christianity with a very specific message being taught to enslaved people. Slaves, be obedient to your masters. Cherry picking the Bible to say, the Bible doesn't condemn slavery. And in the South, you have the growth of a very fundamentalist version of Christianity, a literal interpretation of the Bible. Oh, Jesus never condemned slavery. Moses had slaves. All the Hebrew patriarchs had servants and slaves. Therefore, God is perfectly okay with slavery, just as gender inequality, etc., is all ordained by God. Women should be silent in churches, etc. So they have a very literal and fundamentalist reading of the Bible. Now, this doesn't matter because these denominations are fairly decentralized, but eventually it does. Before the Civil War starts in the 1840s, the Methodists and the Baptists the church breaks over the question of slavery.
John Brown was undeniably a Christian man, but unlike his Quaker counterparts, he was also undeniably a very violent man. But for Manisha, his violence is not at all an absurd response when acquainted with the violence of the men he attacked.
He became known for this particular incident called the Potawatomi Massacre, in which he and his sons killed some pro-slavery settlers. And these people were not particularly innocent. They were unsavory characters. Many of them had been pro-slavery people themselves. One of them was a non-slaveholder who had threatened one of Brown's family members for speaking about racial equality. Many of them were involved in enslaving not only African Americans, but also Native Americans. And Native Americans didn't kind of like them at all. And many of these pro-slavery ministers had started, the Shawnee Mission in Kansas, and they used it as an excuse not just to Christianize forcibly Native Americans, but also to sort of enslave them, use them for labor and really ill-treat them. They were also known particularly for sexual violence against local Native American women. And people don't talk about this. Even historians ignore this when they talk about Brown's retaliation in Potawatomi against these kinds of men, these pro-slavery settlers. Now, Brown attacks them in the night, and they attack them with broadswords, and they are literally hacked to death they're killed with broadswords. They're not shot. So that seems like really violent and kind of egregious. But the kinds of tactics that Brown adopted there was very familiar to Native Americans. That's how they retaliated. These were Indian tactics, attacking at night, attacking with swords, the settlers, the post-slavery settlers. And interestingly enough, after the massacre, Brown manages to escape the authorities with the help of local Native Americans. And so in my book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, I really try to put Brown's violence in context to the amount of violence that pro-slavery men and settlers are actually unleashing in the country as a whole. First with the fugitive slave law, literally invading and attacking free Black communities and in northern cities in order to render fugitive slaves, sometimes even kidnapping free Blacks. Another incident that supposedly really influenced Brown was the caning of Charles Sumner, the abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, on the floor of Congress in 1856 by Preston Brooks, a South Carolinian congressman. And the idea was to silence abolitionists through violence, which of course Southerners had done right from the start, burning their pamphlets, lynching them. So that is the violent context in which we should understand John Brown. And most abolitionists and African Americans, when they resorted to violence, tended to do it in self-defense, whether it was obstructing fugitive slave rendition, which I call fugitive slave rebellions, the so-called Christiana riot in Pennsylvania, there are other incidents. John Brown's predecessors, white abolitionists who went down south to run off slaves. Sometimes they were captured, imprisoned, lynched, etc. So he is definitely at that time done with words. He is looking to retaliate against Southerners. He does that in Kansas and kind of inspires many free staters in Kansas to take up arms and to sort of defend the free state majority in Kansas. And Brown is definitely, I think, influenced by these mini sort of confrontations against slavery, whether it was the Fugitive Slave Rebellions, the Kansas Wars, and then finally he comes up with a plan, his own plan, to run away slaves, to start a rebellion in Virginia. And that is comes at the end of the decade, right, of the 1850s, when Southern slaveholders are demanding reopening the African slave trade, the most extreme of them. They're demanding a federal slave code in the territories. The Dred Scott decision has been taken that, Black men have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. As the Chief Justice then, Roger Taney, put it. You had the caning of Sumner, too, in 1856, and the sack of Lawrence the same year in Kansas. So this is what is shaping Brown's conviction that abolitionists needed to fight fire with fire, that it was no longer enough to have meetings and publish pamphlets, because Southerners had reacted with real repression there, right? Burning their pamphlets, imprisoning them. There was no freedom of speech or press or assembly when it came to abolitionists. And so that is the environment. And Brown is not alone in doing this. There are a lot of Black and white abolitionists who have decided in the 1850s that the only recourse left to them, since slaveholders at that time literally dominated the federal government and all its three branches, that the only recourse left to them was direct action in the streets.
So Brown becomes one of a growing collective of abolitionists with the conviction that violence was a necessary evil on the path to liberation. While the legends treat Brown as if he killed hundreds, it seems more likely that he killed fewer than a dozen people, but all were done in the name of abolition. Brown's most famous attack, and the one that ultimately got him killed, was an attack on the Federal Arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. The arsenal was the biggest manufacturer of weapons in the South. Brown planned to steal a large quantity of weapons and then distribute them to the enslaved communities in the surrounding area, hoping they would be able to overtake their enslavers. While Brown and his 18 men were able to successfully take over the armory, the end result did not lead to immediate mass liberation, and instead led to the immediate death of several of his soldiers and his own arrest. On the morning of his execution, on December 2nd, 1859, John Brown handed a note to one of the men guarding him. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." Manisha made clear that even with his extreme methods, she believes the term vigilante is ill-fitting for Brown.
I don't apply the term vigilante or terrorist to Brown or any of the abolitionists who decided to fight back or who used violence in self-defense. I see some really committed pacifists writing about Brown, like Garrison, or if you read Henry David Thoreau, the apostle of civil disobedience, who inspired Mahatma Gandhi to undertake nonviolent resistance to oppression in India, right? Who in turn inspired Dr. King in the civil rights movement. You know, if I look at the abolitionists, they're talking about civil disobedience, nonviolent action, but they are always also talking about violence in self-defense, which is the traditional justification for violence. When is it okay to be violent? And Black people know this. You know, it's very easy to sort of look at people like Brown and say, oh my God, he was so violent. But what about the daily violence that is being visited on generations of African Americans for decades? That's what Brown was thinking about when he launched his war against slavery.
Act 2. This is a Muslim area. In January of 2013, a YouTube channel started posting grainy, awkward, and disturbing videos. They were filmed and uploaded by a group which called themselves Muslim Patrol.
So Muslim Patrol, move away from the mosque. Move away from the mosque now, okay? Do you understand?
The group, which included at least 3 British converts, walked the streets of East London telling individuals that they were in a Muslim area and pointing out activities that they declared to be haram, forbidden. Zacharias Pieri is the Associate Professor of International Relations and National Security at the University of South Florida. He's written on a variety of international modern Islamic situations, from Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda to the Tablighi Jamaat movement. Here's Zacharias on what the videos showed.
The videos basically showed this group of men walking around the streets of East London late at night. They were almost always hooded or masked. And what they were doing in the videos was a form of morality policing. And so they would call for women to cover up and dress in Islamic ways. They would challenge individuals who were walking past carrying containers of alcohol and ask them to tip the alcohol out and say, this is a Muslim area, you're not allowed alcoholic drinks.
Forbidden evil. Alcohol is evil. No alcohol, yes? Yeah. Have a good day.
They would ask heterosexual couples who are holding hands not to hold hands because it was indecent in the public space.
You need to control this area, and you need to forbid these people from dressing like this and exposing themselves outside the mosque.
And then they also harassed individuals that they suspected of being homosexual. And they used some pretty horrible and discriminatory language that I won't repeat. Told them that they were dirty, that they shouldn't be walking through an area that was, in their minds, a Muslim zone.
Yeah, you're gay, mate. Get out of here, mate. Get out of here.
So really, that was the type of activities that they were engaging in. They believed that they were enforcing strict Islamic standards in what they believed to be a predominantly Muslim area of London.
But their internet footprint and the news coverage about them far exceeded the reach of East London.
And of course, the videos went viral for obvious reasons. They not only went viral in the UK, but around the world. And they got a lot of attention. The individuals were subsequently arrested by the police. I think 5 of the individuals went to court. 3 of the individuals ended up being prosecuted with some sentencing. 2 of the individuals were subsequently released and have no record of further activities since then. But one of the individuals involved was subsequently rearrested and re-imprisoned for glorification of jihadist violence at a later date.
Muslim Patrol understood themselves to be engaging in an Islamic practice called Hizbah. I asked Zacharias to explain more precisely what exactly Hizbah means.
So historically, it falls under this notion or concept, which is called commanding of right and forbidding of wrong. So that's the concept that Muslims are incumbent to have a certain standard of, I don't want to say the word policing, but rather like a set standard by which one lives their life in public. And the reason for that is that really sin is viewed in 2 ways. There's sins that are committed in private and sins that are committed in public. And sins that are committed in public are seen to be worse than sins committed in private, because those committed in public have the impact of affecting the community at large. And so in a traditional Islamic society, that's a society in which there is an Islamic government and the law of the land is Sharia law. The ruler is obligated to appoint an individual who manages the morality policing of the community. And that formal morality policing board is called the Hizbah, and they are obligated to command right and forbid wrong. So, it wasn't uncommon to see Hizbah patrols in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan, in Sudan, in Iran, in countries that maintain Islamic forms of government. But obviously, that doesn't really apply to the West, which are often liberal democracies. They are nominally Christian, if not mostly secular, multicultural polities. So that obligation doesn't really exist in the West. So while in some Muslim countries there is an obligation and an expectation for Hizbah patrols to operate in those societies, that doesn't really carry across or apply to Muslim communities in the West.
Hizbah has been tried in a variety of cultures, including modern nations, with varying degrees of intensity and success. But Zacharias makes clear that it is often a primary concern when Muslim extremists come into power.
It's also one of the first things I've noticed, that when jihadist groups move from being a terrorist group to more of an insurgent group, that's when a jihadist group is able to take hold of land. One of the first things they do is initiate Hizbah. So we saw this in northern Mali, for example, when jihadists took over large swaths of the north of Mali, the first thing they did was to enforce certain standards around dress codes for men and women, banning of music, policing smoking, drinking, things like that. Boko Haram, when it had its short-lived caliphate in the northeast of Nigeria, also worked quickly to establish Hisbah patrols. So I think partly because it is, it's almost like performative action to it, symbolizes that the group is there. We're now controlling the situation. We are going to have a real impact on what goes on in this community. And some people are more sympathetic to morality policing, and other people are just absolutely not. This is not going to work for me. Please leave me alone.
Muslim Patrol was not the only instance of attempted Hisbah in the UK.
The activities of Muslim Patrol built on a much longer trajectory of Islamist activism in the UK. So even going back to, 3 to 5 years before they even emerged, there were not so much instances of morality policing, but you would see things like posters appearing in predominantly Muslim areas saying things like, this is a Sharia zone, no porn, no homosexuality, no gambling, no alcohol, no drugs, no smoking, no music. Now, there was no one to enforce that, but just the act of putting posters like that up can be fairly divisive in a community. And then, of course, there was the pretty infamous case now in the northern town of Derby, where individuals, again, very small groups of young Muslim men would go around putting pamphlets through people's doors. And these, again, focus specifically on combating homosexuality in the community. And so the pamphlets would say things like, turn or burn, homosexuality is a cancer, or they would spell out G-A-Y with God abhors you. And again, things like this were seen as extremely provocative, extremely destabilizing to good intercommunal relationships in the UK. Again, these types of actions don't reflect what the broader Muslim community was doing, but I think this was really the first time that people in the UK were prosecuted for homophobic activities linked to Islamist extremist ideologies. So, all of this stuff was going on in 2010, 11, up into 2012. There's the fairly famous clothing store called H&M, and they had billboards of young women wearing bikinis on a sun-kissed beach somewhere in the Mediterranean, and someone took a can of paint and sprayed over them, but sprayed what looked like a burqa over the woman, so all you could see were her eyes. So again, that was another manifestation of, this is a Muslim space.
So the concept of some kind of public forbiddance of evil is not alien in Islamic culture. But these men had to know that they wouldn't get very far with their understaffed enforcement in the middle of the United Kingdom. So what was it all for? According to Zacharias, it all comes back to a man named Anjem Choudary.
Anjem Choudary is often described as an Islamist cleric in the media. Muslim religious leaders would say he is not a cleric, that he's a propagandist and an extremist. But he was born in 1969. He was educated at Southampton University with a law degree background. He practiced as a lawyer for a while in the UK, but was then disbarred from the profession. But over time, he adopted a very hostile view of British culture and Western culture more generally. And he started groups that were since banned by the UK government. Those groups were Al-Mujahirun, Islam for UK, and Muslims Against Crusades. And so I think the Muslim patrol groups said that they were affiliated to a project called the Sharia Project at that time. And Anjem Chowdhury was the guy who was behind the Sharia Project. And the goal of Sharia Patrol, you might think, would be to enforce Islamic morality standards in London. That's just not going to happen, ever, in London, right? London's a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious place. The goal of Muslim Patrol, in my opinion, wasn't necessarily to, Islamize East London, but rather it was a performative act. It was to garner media attention, to oxygenate and give platform to Anjem Chowdhury, who could then go on television as the media decried how awful and horrible this was, and they would invite him on TV or radio or to comment, and it would give him a platform to further air his views. Because the media loves nothing more than a cleric, Islamic cleric, spouting how awful the country is, that the country would collapse, that an Islamic emirate would be formed. And of course, Chowdhury played on this idea of the Great Replacement Theory before Great Replacement Theory came to most people's attention, right? Because he would say things like, to all the British people, I want you to know that you can't stop us. Muslims will be in the majority by 2040 or by 2050. No matter what you do, we will win. We will take over. We will establish an emirate. And language like that is really quite extreme.
Among the men who engaged with Muslim Patrol, 3 were converts. According to Zacharias, the use of these immature Muslims was a key part of Chowdhury's strategy.
I think often people who convert to a religion, just generally speaking, whether it's Islam or Christianity or other forms, do so out of choice and do so out of a high level of conviction, especially if it's later in life. And often those individuals can go through a period of a belief that is fairly intensified compared to those who have been in the religion since birth or for a long time. And so, I think there could be that kind of element to it. But you are right, within the Muslim patrols, 3 of the individuals were white British converts to Islam. He was really instrumental behind recruiting and influencing young men who might not have had a particularly in-depth understanding of Islam, but played on things like masculinity, ideas of strength versus weakness, ideas of purity, ideas of doing something to challenge existing systems of power or governance in the West. And I think that's what really attracted some of these young men to his movement, because Anjem Chowdhury would say things like, democracy is an invalid system of governance, that Western values were immoral, that the West was drunk on its own decadence, that the West had declined into a pit of filth and sexual immorality, and that society was decaying and collapsing around the individual, and he would call Muslims to separate and segregate themselves from the wider British culture. And he called for Muslims to harden their own identities against the rest of the population, right? And so that kind of language attracts a certain type of person. He was really quite successful in attracting small groups of young men who were either self-radicalized or radicalized by Anjem Choudhury himself, and then organizing those young men into small but effective groups.
Muslim Patrol and the teachings of Choudhury were not popular among most Muslims. Even though Hizbah has its place in an Islamic society, for the majority of Muslims, this expression of it was clearly inappropriate.
Anjem Choudhury never really managed to attract a large number of people to his cause. The majority of Muslims in Britain were absolutely horrified by Anjem Choudhury and his views. He did not represent in any way the majority of British Muslims. It's quite polarizing. Most Muslims would themselves reject that kind of language, but it sells newspapers. It makes for good viewing, if we can say that in some ways. So I think Anjem Choudhury was a regular on some of these programs because he was predictably, people knew what he was going to say.
But while many Muslim leaders distance themselves from Choudhury, it seems their reproof relates to his methods more than his critiques of Britain.
As far as I know, the majority of Muslims and Muslim leaders in the UK were vociferously against Muslim Patrol. Now, it's important to say that if you dig deeper, it's not necessarily that Muslim leaders were against what Muslim Patrol had diagnosed as the issue of society, right? Because in the interviews that I conducted, nobody really said they're wrong in what they're saying. Rather, it was they're wrong in how they're going about trying to remedy the situation. So Muslim leaders that I spoke to would say things like, the United Kingdom is a liberal democracy. It is not an Islamic country, and therefore the rules that govern Hizbah or morality policing just do not apply here, right? Because Islamic law regulates how you can apply Muslim morality policing, and it's usually only within the context of an Islamic state that's governed by an Islamic ruler and an Islamic justice system. You can't just pick things up and move them to a different context and run with them because you self-appoint and self-empower or self-radicalize and decide that that's what you want to do. But I think there is much more sympathy with this idea that Western values and Western society really is falling into a pit of degeneracy, especially around, ultra-liberal values. So I would say that that's more the kind of dichotomy that that emerged. There may be a little bit of broader sympathy from some individuals, but really in this case, I think the individuals who were engaged in Muslim Patrol were just, even within like a radical Islamist or even within a jihadist context, were so far off the mark in what they were trying to do and how they were trying to do it, and that they were bringing such overwhelming negative attention to Muslims in Britain as a whole, that there was a fairly large backlash and fairly united backlash from Muslim communities in the UK, including Ibrahim Mogra, who at the time was the Assistant General Secretary of the British Muslim Council of Britain, Shams Adua, who was, at the time, a young and charismatic, energetic imam at Ibrahim College. And so, these individuals also managed to take to the news, get on social media, put out their own commentary as to why what Muslim Patrol were doing was wrong, why it didn't represent broader Muslims, and how implementation of Muslim policing, morality policing, has to be governed by Islamic law. And because there isn't Islamic law in the UK, you just can't do it.
But ultimately, the condemnation of Muslim Patrol is still quite clear. And unlike Manish's view of John Brown, Islamic leaders, including Imam and former Assistant Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain, Ibrahim Mogra, have been very comfortable with the so-called V word.
The Muslim leaders' response, they were really quite clear in describing this as vigilante justice. And that links back to the wider topic you were interested of vigilantism. And I think Ibrahim Mogra specifically said, just call them vigilantes when I asked him, what are they doing? What framework are they doing it in? And he said there's absolutely no justification for their actions in a liberal democracy. It's not acceptable to impose Sharia law on non-Muslims, though he didn't say anything about imposing it on Muslims. And he said, just call them vigilantes.
5 of the members of Muslim Patrol ended up in prison shortly after the publication of their videos. Anjem Choudary did a 5-year stint in prison from 2016 to 2021 for pledging allegiance to ISIS. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2024 for directing the terrorist group Al-Muhajiroun. Act 3. The Fourth Philosophy. In the last few centuries BC and the 1st century AD, many Jewish thinkers fit into one of 3 major factions or philosophies. They were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And much of what we know about them comes from the work of Flavius Josephus, an ancient Jewish philosopher who records his observations of the different philosophies in his book, Antiquities of the Jews. The Pharisees were known for high respect of elders and the use of reason to determine how one ought to live. Both of these translated into a high regard for oral Jewish tradition in addition to the laws of Moses. They also believed that souls lived on after death, with some being punished in a quote-unquote everlasting prison, and others being able to find new life as a reward for their virtue. The Sadducees were a more elite class of individuals. They were usually wealthy and known for collaborating with Roman rule. Unlike the Pharisees, they largely rejected oral tradition and bound themselves only to Mosaic law. They did not believe in an afterlife and instead taught that the soul dies with the body. The Essenes, who most people are less familiar with given their absence from the Bible, were ascetics who separated themselves from the rest of society in male-only groups. They did not marry or have servants. Like the Pharisees, they believed in immortality after death and that they would be rewarded for their righteousness. While the Essenes are nearly always mentioned in writings about the Jewish factions, there's actually a 4th faction which Josephus mentions, and this one does make an appearance in the Bible. But Josephus does not seem impressed by the 4th philosophy. Here's a LibriVox recording of Book 18 of Josephus's Antiquities, where he lays out pretty plainly what he thinks of this 4th sect.
All sorts of misfortunes also sprang from these men, and the nation was infected with this doctrine to an incredible degree. One violent war came upon us after another, and we lost our friends which used to alleviate our pains. There were also very great robberies and murder of our principal men.
Members of the 4th philosophy were known as zealots, and one of them, Simon the Zealot, was among the 12 disciples of Jesus. The Bible has very little to say about Simon or his zeal, and he's really only mentioned when the rest of the disciples are listed. But it is likely that he was a member of the Zealots, and it is also likely that he would have turned from his Zealot beliefs when he began to follow Jesus, as those two lifestyles would have surely clashed. Because while Jesus famously preached, "Love your enemy and do good to those who persecute you," the way of the Zealots was to violently resist rule by the Romans. The movement was started by two men, one known as Zadok the priest, and the other called Judas the Galilean. In 63 BC, the Romans took over Jerusalem and the rest of Judea with it. Around 7 AD, Judas and Zadok helped lead a tax strike against the Romans.
Yet was there one Judas, a Gaulanite, of a city whose name was Gamala, who, taking with him Sadok, a Pharisee, became zealous to draw them to a revolt, who both said that this taxation was no better than an introduction to slavery, and exhorted the nation to assert their liberty.
But what started with a boycott on Roman taxation quickly became bloody. The views of the Zealots were generally aligned with those of the Pharisees. Where they differed is that the Zealots were unflinchingly opposed to being ruled by anyone other than God. And for the Zealots, this conviction was worth dying for.
They also do not value dying any kinds of death, nor indeed do they heed the deaths of their relations and friends, nor can any such fear make them call any man Lord.
With no fear of being killed, it seems they also were unafraid to kill those who stood in their way. A sect within the fourth philosophy known as Sicarii, or daggermen, carried knives called sicars, and were known for being skilled assassins. They attacked Roman soldiers and tax collectors, and even killed fellow Jews in the process of their revolution. Again, Josephus speaks strongly against their actions. He even calls into question their motives.
This was done in pretense indeed for the public welfare, but in reality for the hopes of gain to themselves. For Judas and Sadduc, who excited a fourth philosophic sect among us, and had a great many followers therein, filled our civil government with tumults at present, and lay the foundations of our future miseries by this system of philosophy, which we were before unacquainted withal.
Josephus goes as far as to blame the Zealots for the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD.
Nay, the sedition at last increased so high that the very temple of God was burnt down by their enemies' fire.
It is the view of Josephus and many modern historians that the Zealots helped sow division among the Jewish people, and that much of the actual fighting that occurred leading up to the temple's destruction was fought between Jews of differing viewpoints. But the Romans got involved and continued to tighten their forces closer and closer to the temple until one soldier, so the story goes, threw a torch at the tapestry which lined the walls of the temple, and the entire building burned to the ground, with many Jews inside. For the Zealots, it would appear their resistance to Roman rule had failed, and that life for the Jews would now be, more certainly, lived in submission to the occupying nation. And the Zealots who had survived the initial siege would not stand for this. In Book 7 of a different book from Josephus, The Wars of the Jews, Josephus recounts a speech that was given by a Zealot leader named Eleazar. The speech told them that the true Zealot had only one option: suicide. Here's Eleazar's speech being read from another LibriVox recording. It's been cut down from its original length.
To be sure, we weakly hoped to have preserved ourselves, and ourselves alone, still in a state of freedom, as if we had been guilty of no sins ourselves against God, nor been partners with those of others. We also taught other men to preserve their liberty. Wherefore, consider how God hath convinced us that our hopes were in vain, by bringing such distress upon us in the desperate state we are now in, and which is beyond all our expectations. For that fire which was driven upon our enemies did not of its own accord turn back upon the wall which we had built. This was the effect of God's anger against us for our manifold sins, which we have been guilty of in a most insolent and extravagant manner with regard to our own countrymen, the punishments of which let us not receive from the Romans, but from God himself, as executed by our own hands, for these will be more moderate than the other. Let our wives die before they are abused, and our children before they have tasted of slavery, and after we have slain them, let us bestow that glorious benefit upon one another mutually, and preserve ourselves in freedom, as an excellent funeral monument for us. But first let us destroy our money and the fortress by fire, for I am well assured that this will be a great grief to the Romans, that they shall not be able to seize upon our bodies, and shall fall of our wealth also. And let us spare nothing but our provisions, for they will be a testimonial when we are dead that we were not subdued for want of necessaries, but that, according to our original resolution, we have preferred death before slavery."
When Eleazar completed his speech, some were quick to agree with him, others were not. Sensing that some were uncertain, he delivered a second speech, 4 times as long. It was after this speech that the men began to act.
Now as Eleazar was proceeding on in this exhortation, they all cut him off short, and made haste to do the work, as full of an unconquerable ardor of mind, and moved with a demoniacal fury. So they went their ways, as one still endeavoring to be before another, and as thinking that this eagerness would be a demonstration of their courage and good conduct, if they could avoid appearing in the last class. So great was the zeal they were in to slay their wives and their children, and themselves also. Nor indeed, when they came to the work itself, did their courage fail them, as one might imagine it would have done, but they then held fast the same resolution, without wavering, which they had upon the hearing of Eleazar's speech, while yet every one of them still retained the natural passion of love to themselves and their families, because the reasoning they went upon appeared to them to be very just, even with regard to those that were dearest to them. For the husbands tenderly embraced their wives, and took their children into their arms, and gave the longest parting kisses to them, with tears in their eyes. Yet at the same time did they complete what they had resolved on, as if they had been executed by the hands of strangers, and they had nothing else for their comfort but the necessity they were in of doing this execution, to avoid that prospect they had of the miseries they were to suffer.
After they killed their families, the men drew lots, and 10 men were chosen to kill all the others. When these 10 had finished their work, one was chosen to kill the other 9 and then kill himself. Including women and children, Josephus writes that 960 people were killed in response to the speech of Eleazar. So the zealots died with as much zeal as they lived, but ultimately, both in life and death, they were unable to fully destabilize Roman rule in Judea.